Ever get that feeling? Like you really want to dive deep into something new, but, without getting completely overwhelmed.
Well, that's exactly what we're doing today, taking a deep dive into this thing called vibe coding.
Yep, exactly right. And if this is your first time hearing this term, well, vibe coding is basically turning the way we usually think about making software upside down.
So let's break this down. Vibe coding, I mean, it sounds kind of intuitive, doesn't it? The idea is basically that you describe, just in plain English, the software you imagine like you're talking to a friend. And then this AI takes your description and actually writes the code for you. So no more like getting stuck trying to figure out the crazy syntax of, Python or JavaScript. It's all about the idea, the vibe of what you want to create. And the real magic here is that these AI models, they're not just, simple chatbots or something. They've been trained on just mountains and mountains of code. So they can understand what you mean and actually build real working software. Imagine like having the super smart coding assistant who just gets your vision and takes care of all the technical stuff behind the scenes. They've kind of learned to understand what you're trying to do, not just the words you're using.
And this is where it gets really interesting. The whole concept of vibe coding really started to take off thanks to this AI researcher, Andrej Karpathy. He had this vision of programming where it wasn't about all these strict rules, but more about just telling the AI what you wanted. And it would just, figure it out. Big change from how we've always done things.
And in this deep dive, that's exactly what we're going to explore. We'll look at the main tools that are making this happen right now, like GitHub Copilot, Cursor Composer. We'll dive into some real world examples, talk about the challenges, and of course, what this might mean for like programmers and the whole tech world.
Yeah, absolutely. And who can actually use this? Well, pretty much anyone, really. If you've ever thought about learning to code, this could be a good way to start. Entrepreneurs, designers can use it to prototype ideas without needing a whole team of coders right away. Even if you're already a programmer, it could help you work way faster by handing off the boring stuff to the AI.
Yeah.
And honestly, even if you're just curious about where tech is going, this is something you should know about. And you don't need to be a coding whiz to follow along.
Yeah, and to really see how fast and easy vibe coding can be, imagine someone like Sarah. She's a graphic designer, had this amazing idea for her online portfolio, never coded anything in her life. But using one of these tools, she just described what she wanted, and in a few hours, boom, she had a working prototype. That's the kind of power and accessibility we're talking about here.
I mean, that's just incredible. But to really get how big of a deal this is, it helps to kind of look back a bit, see how we got to this point where you can basically just say what you want and have code appear. So yeah, the evolution is clear. It's this incredible shift. But you mentioned it's not just magic. What's actually going on under the hood to make this vibe coding revolution happen?
You're right. It's not magic. And coding hasn't always been this conversational. It's gone through this huge transformation from being this really specialized skill to something that's, more like a creative tool that anyone can use. Like if we go back to the very beginning, the 1940s, 50s, remember punch cards? Were those actually a real thing?
Oh yeah, they were definitely real. In those early days, it was like the most painstaking process. You had to use these punch cards, basically cards with holes punched in them, to tell the computer what to do. A single program could be like tens of thousands of these cards. And just one tiny mistake, one wrong hole, and boom, the whole thing's useless.
Yeah.
So you can see how interacting with computers back then was very direct, but also very unforgiving.
Oh man, I can just imagine the frustration. And the language they used to program back then, I bet it wasn't very user-friendly.
Not at all. They used what's called machine code, which is basically just ones and zeros directly corresponding to the computer's hardware. It was incredibly slow, super error prone, and you needed this deep understanding of how the machine actually worked at a physical level. Then, things got a little bit better with assembly language in the 50s. They started using simple commands like ADD, MOV, three-letter things, but it was still very tied to specific hardware and not that much easier for humans to understand. So basically, the early days of coding were all about working directly with the machine's language, which wasn't very human-friendly at all.
Yeah, sounds incredibly specialized. So what was the big breakthrough that made programming more like something a human could actually do?
The real game changer was when these high-level programming languages came along, starting in the late 50s and into the 60s, languages like Fortran in 57, COBOL in 59. They started using syntax that looked more like, plain English. So they took away a lot of those nitty-gritty hardware details. Like in Fortran, if you wanted to add two numbers, let's say B and C, and store the result in A, you could just write A equals B plus C. Pretty simple, right? So this move away from the physical machine, that was the first step in making coding a tool for thinking, not just for technical experts.
Wow, that's a big jump from just strings of ones and zeros.
Huge leap. And this made coding way faster and more accessible. It meant that, computers could be used for all sorts of things like science, business, not just by, the hardware gurus. That was a really big step.
Okay, so we moved from machine code to something more readable. What came next? Because I imagine as programs got bigger, things must have gotten pretty complicated to manage.
Yeah. And that's where structured programming came in the 60s and 70s. As programs grew, the code often became this tangled mess like spaghetti with all these jumps and loops. So structured programming tried to fix this with things like functions, control structures. Those are things like if statements, for loops, while loops, and languages like C, which came out in 72, were big for this. Basically allowed you to break your code into smaller pieces, make it more logical, more reusable. So it's easier to write, debug and maintain. And it also forced people to start thinking about code in a more organized and structured way.
So it was all about bringing order to the chaos.
Exactly. And that idea of systematic thinking, that's still, super important in software development today.
Then in the 80s, I remember hearing a lot about object-oriented programming. What was the big deal there?
Yeah, OOP was all over the place back then. It was a pretty big shift. Instead of just focusing on procedures or functions, object-oriented programming organized code around objects. These are basically self-contained units that have both data and functions. Languages like C++ in 83 and Java in 95, they were central to this. And what this meant was that you could model real-world things more directly in your code. So like you could define a car object with properties like its speed, color, and actions like drive and stop. So the code started to reflect the complexity of the real world.
That makes sense. So how did that actually improve things?
Well, one of the biggest advantages was this thing called inheritance. Basically, it meant you could build new objects based on existing ones so you didn't have to start from scratch every time. This made code way more reusable and scalable so you could handle these huge complex projects like operating systems, video games. Then, of course, came the whole internet explosion in the 90s and 2000s.
Yeah, that changed everything.
That's right. And it created this massive need for fast, flexible tools specifically for building websites. And that's where scripting languages like Python from 91 and JavaScript in 95 became really important. These languages were known for being, simpler to read, easier to learn. Like in Python, to print a message, you just write print and then the message in parentheses. Right. Super straightforward.
Yeah, nice and clean.
And this era also saw the rise of these open source communities, which was huge. Developers all over the world were collaborating, sharing code for free. Programming wasn't just getting simpler, it was also becoming way more collaborative. Then, of course, we get to the 2010s and the increasing role of AI. How has artificial intelligence started to change the world of programming?
Yeah, AI's been a game changer.
Absolutely. In the 2010s, we started to see AI being integrated into how programmers actually work. We saw tools like GitHub Copilot, which came out in 2021, powered by OpenAI's Codex. What these tools could do was actually generate code based on the comments you wrote or even just a little bit of code you already had. So for example, if a programmer wrote a comment like, function to sort an array, Copilot could just suggest the actual code for that function. So basically we started seeing automation coming into the coding process itself.
So like having an AI pair programmer right there helping you out.
Yeah, exactly. And this started to move programming away from just pure manual effort and towards more automation. It even hinted at a future where, people who weren't expert coders could start creating software.
And that brings us to vibe coding. How does this all fit together?
Well, vibe coding is like the next logical step in this evolution. Now, you don't even need to write those detailed comments or start snippets of code. You can just say what you want in plain English. Something like make a to-do list app, and the AI will try to generate a bunch of the code needed to actually build that. Tools like Cursor Composer and the newer versions of GitHub Copilot are basically turning programming into a conversation. You say what you want, and the AI tries to translate that into working code. So it's all about taking that barrier down between human thought and what a computer can understand.
So to sum up, we've gone from these super low-level instructions with punch cards all the way to just talking to the computer in our own language. Programming's gone from something only experts could do to something that, anyone with an idea could potentially use. And the whole process has shifted from being super manual and focused on tiny details to something that's more automated and focused on the big picture, the user's vision.
Right. And that's the really important part. Vibe coding isn't just some, cool tech thing. It's part of this bigger trend of making technology more accessible and powerful for everyone. It could totally change how we think about software development, make it faster, more innovative, and even change how we learn to code. Instead of focusing on all the little rules, it's about, having ideas and expressing them clearly.
So we've seen the history, but what's actually making this work? What's under the hood? Because it's not just magic, right?
Definitely not magic. It's all driven by some pretty amazing AI and the platforms that let us use it. We've traced the historical progression. Now let's really delve into the core technology that powers vibe coding.
So at the heart of it are these things called large language models, LLMs. These are AI systems trained on huge amounts of text so they can understand and generate, human-like text. And the cool thing is that text includes a ton of computer code. So think of these LLMs like, digital translators. They're fluent in English, Spanish, but also in Python, JavaScript, all these programming languages.
So when I describe what I want in plain English, the LLM can actually understand what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, exactly. When you say something like, make a button that turns green when you click it, the LLM doesn't just see a bunch of words, it sees what you want. Like you want this interactive button that changes color. And because it's been trained on so much code, it can actually generate the code for that using a mix of HTML, CSS, JavaScript.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
Where does all this training data for these LLMs come from?
Well, it's a massive amount of data. We're talking about billions of lines of code from all sorts of places. Open source projects, online tutorials, documentation, even just descriptions of what code is supposed to do. And through this process called machine learning, these LLMs, they kind of pick up on all the patterns and relationships in this data. So they learn that, sort a list often means using a function called sort in many programming languages. They're basically learning to write code by analyzing tons and tons of examples. And companies like OpenAI and Anthropic, they've been really focusing on building these models specifically for coding, which has made them way more accurate and useful for vibe coding.
So it's like the AI is this super smart translator taking my instructions and turning them into the precise language that computers understand.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. But it's important to be realistic. It doesn't always get it perfect. Sometimes if you're too vague or don't give enough detail, the AI might misunderstand what you want. But the technology is improving so fast, that's what makes vibe coding so exciting.
Okay, so we have these powerful LLMs as the foundation. But how do we actually use them? What are the tools that put this AI power into our hands?
Well, this is where things get practical. Vibe coding wouldn't be very useful without tools that make these LLMs accessible. Some of the big names right now are GitHub Copilot, OpenAI Codex itself, and then tools like Cursor Composer.
Let's start with GitHub Copilot. Seems like everyone's talking about that one.
Yeah, Copilot's been getting a lot of attention. It's basically like an AI coding buddy that works right inside popular code editors like Visual Studio Code. It's a plugin and it's really intuitive to use. So as you're writing a comment, like describing what you want the code to do, or even just starting to write some code, Copilot will try to suggest what you might want to write next. Like if you start defining a function to, say, calculate someone's age based on their birthday, Copilot might suggest the rest of the code to actually do that calculation.
That sounds pretty helpful for developers who are already using these code editors.
Yeah.
What makes it so valuable?
Well, it's super fast. It works really well with the way developers already write code. And over time, it learns how you like to code and gives better suggestions. It's especially good for, developers who want to work faster or who are just learning and want to see real world examples of how to do things.
Okay, so that's Copilot. You also mentioned OpenAI Codex. How does that differ?
So Codex is actually the underlying AI model that powers Copilot. But unlike Copilot, which is, tied to a code editor, Codex is available through an API. That means developers can use it to build their own custom applications and integrations. You basically give it prompts like, write Python code to calculate a 20% tip on a $75 bill, and it spits out the code.
So it's more of a building block that other tools can use.
Yeah, exactly. It's very flexible, supports a bunch of programming languages, and can be used on its own. So it's good for developers who want to build their own AI-powered features into their systems.
And then there's Cursor Composer, which is designed for people who maybe aren't hardcore programmers.
Yeah, Cursor Composer is all about conversational coding. It's designed to be really easy to use, even if you've never written code before. You basically just chat with it.
Yeah.
You could say something like, I want a to-do list app with a button to mark tasks as done, and it will guide you through building it step by step.
That does sound way less scary for someone who's new to coding. What makes it so good for beginners?
Well, it's just super user-friendly. It really feels like you're talking to someone who knows how to code and wants to help you out. It hides a lot of the technical complexity, so you can focus on your idea, not on the nitty-gritty details of the code. It's perfect for like entrepreneurs, designers, anyone who wants to make a quick prototype without needing to learn traditional coding.
So we have this range of tools, some for experienced developers, some for beginners. The big goal seems to be making software development more like, having a conversation.
Exactly. These tools are different ways to get into vibe coding, but they all have the same goal: make creating software easier, more intuitive, and more open to everyone.
Sounds great. So for someone listening who might be thinking, okay, I want to try this, where would they even start?
Well, getting started is actually pretty simple. First, you got to choose the right tool. If you're comfortable in a code editor like Visual Studio Code and want to try out AI assistance, go with GitHub Copilot. But if you'd rather just describe your ideas and have the AI do the heavy lifting, then something like Cursor Composer is probably a better starting point.
Okay, tool chosen. What next?
Next is setup. For Copilot, you need Visual Studio Code on your computer. Then you add the Copilot extension. You'll also need to sign in with your GitHub account. They usually have a free trial, then it's a paid subscription. For Cursor Composer, it's even easier. Go to their website, sign up for a free account, and you can start a new project right there in your browser. No need to install anything or configure anything.
Sounds pretty straightforward. Now, how do I actually tell AI what I want? How do I write my first prompt?
Okay, so for your first prompt, keep it simple and direct. A classic starting point is to just try to display a message. So you could try something like print hello world in Python. You should see the AI generate the code, which is just print followed by hello world in parentheses. The key with prompts is to be clear and specific. Saying, build a web page with a blue header is way better than just saying, make something cool for my website. The more detail you give, the better the AI will understand what you want and generate the right code.
Got it. Be clear and specific. What if the AI doesn't get it right the first time?
That's where iteration comes in. It's like a conversation, If the AI generates something you don't like you asked for a blue header, but it made a red one, you just give it more feedback, tweak your prompt. So you could say, change the header color to blue. The more you guide the AI, the better it gets at understanding what you want.
So it's all about back and forth, giving instructions, seeing the output, and refining. Any pro tips for getting even better results?
Yeah, one good trick is to break big ideas into smaller steps. Instead of saying, build a whole e-commerce website all at once, start with something like, create a section to show a list of products with their names and prices. Once you have that working, you can add more stuff like a shopping cart, user logins, payment processing, all that stuff.
Yeah, break it down into manageable chunks. Now, I'm guessing vibe coding, even though it's amazing, isn't perfect. What are some challenges or things to watch out for?
You're right, it's not perfect. It's powerful and getting better fast, but there are some things to be aware of. One thing is that the AI can still make mistakes. It might generate code that looks right, but actually has a logical error, like a loop that never ends. That could cause the program to crash. So it's super important to always test any code the AI generates before you use it in a real project. If you find a problem, you might need to adjust your prompt, give more instructions, or even fix the code yourself.
So it's not a total replacement for understanding how to code and for testing your code carefully.
Not yet, at least not if you want your software to be reliable and secure. Another thing to keep in mind is that AI isn't always great at understanding context. If your prompt isn't detailed enough or assumes the AI knows things it doesn't, it might guess wrong and generate something you didn't want. Like if you just say, make a button, the AI doesn't know what size, color, text, or what it should do when clicked. So again, be specific. Instead of make a button, say, create a large green rectangular button that says submit. And when clicked, it shows a message that says form submitted. Give the AI all the information it needs.
Great advice. So looking ahead, what does the future hold for vibe coding? Where do you see this going?
The future's looking pretty exciting for vibe coding. We'll probably see even smarter AI that can understand not just bits of code, but whole projects. They might even be able to fix their own errors so you don't have to debug as much. And these tools could get so easy to use that anyone can use them, even kids or people on their phones. Imagine describing a full app and having it built in minutes. That's the kind of future we're talking about.
Wow, it really sounds like we're at the start of a revolution in how we build software.
Yeah, I think so. Vibe coding with these AI tools like GitHub Copilot and Cursor Composer is making software development more accessible than ever. And anyone can try it out today. Just remember to test your code, be specific in your prompts, and keep learning as you go. And coming up next, we'll look at some real world stories, see how people are actually using vibe coding to do amazing things.
That's what I'm looking forward to, hearing how people are actually using this in the real world.
So we've gone through the history of programming, looked at the AI tools that are making vibe coding happen, and now let's move from, the theory to the actual practice.
hmm
The important thing to understand is that vibe coding isn't just about the tech, it's a process. You describe your idea, the AI generates the code, and then you, the user, refine it to make it perfect. And this process is letting people, from beginners to experts, create real software, from simple apps to complex systems.
Right. Describe, generate, refine. It's a constant back and forth. That seems key to making it work.
Exactly. So you start by describing your idea, like the specific functionality you want, using plain language. Being clear is super important. So instead of saying something vague like, build something for my website, you'd say, create a web page with a form where people can enter their name and email and submit it. Then tools like Cursor Composer and GitHub Copilot, they take your prompt and use their AI to understand it and generate the code.
So the AI takes the human language and turns it into computer code.
Right. It generates what it thinks is the best code based on your description. Now, sometimes it'll be exactly what you want, but sometimes it might need some tweaking depending on how detailed you were in your prompt. For example, if you just say make a button, the AI might create a very basic, plain button, just the bare minimum.
So it gives you a basic starting point. What if I want the button to actually do something, like have some visual style or functionality?
That's where you refine your prompt. If the code isn't exactly what you wanted, like say you wanted a blue button that shows a message when you click it, but the AI made a plain gray one, you just give more specific instructions. So you could say, make it a blue button, and when someone clicks it, show a JavaScript alert box that says, you click the button. Then the AI will adjust the code, add some CSS for the blue color, and some JavaScript for the alert message. So it's like a conversation. You guide the AI until the code does exactly what you want.
This sounds like a pretty friendly way to build software, especially for people who aren't experts in all the complicated coding rules.
Exactly. It's not about getting everything perfect on the first try. It's about working with the AI, giving feedback, and refining until you get what you want.
Okay, so that's the process. Can you give us some real world examples? Like, how are people actually using vibe coding?
Sure. Let's say we have a small business owner who wants a simple web page to collect customer feedback.
That's something a lot of businesses need. How would they use vibe coding for that?
Well, they could open Cursor Composer and type something like, create a web page with a form where people can enter their name and any comments. And Cursor Composer would generate the basic HTML code for that form. It would be pretty basic at first, just the input fields and a submit button, not very fancy.
So it works, but doesn't look amazing yet. What would they do next?
They could refine their prompt, say something like, add a title to the page, make the form look nicer with some colors and styling, and when someone submits the form, show the data in the browser's console. Then Cursor Composer would update the code, add some CSS for styling, a title for the page, and some JavaScript to handle the form submission and show the data.
So they have a functional, good-looking form now without writing any code themselves.
Exactly. And this whole process, from the basic prompt to the finished form, could take just a few minutes. That shows how fast and easy vibe coding can be. Now let's look at something a bit more complex, maybe using GitHub Copilot. Let's say someone wants to build a number guessing game where the player tries to guess a random number and the game gives clues like too high or too low.
Sounds like a fun project.
Sure.
How would they do that with vibe coding?
So they could start by writing a comment in their code editor, something like, write JavaScript code for a number guessing game where the user gets hints. GitHub Copilot would then analyze that and generate some JavaScript code for the game. It might include the logic for picking a random number, getting the player's guess, and giving feedback. But this initial version might only let the player guess once.
Okay, so it has the basics, but not a full game loop yet.
Yeah.
How would they make it more complete?
They could add another comment like, make it so the player can keep guessing until they get it right, and also keep track of how many guesses they've made. Then Copilot would add a loop to keep asking for guesses until the right number is guessed, and it would add a counter to keep track of the number of guesses. So in just 2 steps, they have a working, playable number guessing game. And this shows how Copilot can handle more complex requests and build on existing code.
So we've seen some examples. Now, what are some tips for actually using vibe coding effectively? Things that'll help people get good results.
Yeah, definitely. One of the biggest things is to be specific in your prompts. The more specific you are, the better the AI will understand what you want. So instead of saying, create a website, say something like, create a website for a bakery with a page for cakes, a page for bread, and a contact form. Give details about colors, layouts, images, everything.
So paint a clear picture for the AI.
Exactly. Another good tip is to break down big projects into smaller steps. Like we saw with the number guessing game, starting with a basic version and then adding features step by step makes it easier for both you and the AI. It's kind of like building a house. You don't try to build the whole thing at once. You start with the foundation, then the walls, then the roof. Same with software.
Makes sense. Break it down into manageable pieces. What about testing?
Mm.
How important is that in vibe coding?
Testing is absolutely crucial, even more so with vibe coding. The AI is still learning and it can make mistakes. So always test the code thoroughly, try different inputs, see if it breaks, and don't be afraid to go back and refine your prompts or even fix the code yourself if needed. Remember, it's a tool to help you, not replace you completely.
So it's about working with the AI, not just blindly trusting it. What about learning? Can vibe coding actually help people learn how to code?
Absolutely. By looking at the code the AI generates, you can actually learn a lot. You can see how different concepts are implemented, different coding patterns, and even learn new tricks and techniques. It's like having a coding tutor right there with you. But it's important to not just copy and paste blindly. Try to understand the code, experiment with it, break it, and see how it works. That's how you really learn.
So it's a learning tool, not just a shortcut.
Yeah.
But with all this automation, do you think programmers will eventually be, out of a job? Will AI replace them entirely?
Well, that's a question a lot of people are asking. Honestly, I think it's more likely that vibe coding will change the role of programmers rather than replace them completely. Yeah. Imagine, like, instead of spending all their time writing code, they can focus on the higher level stuff. Designing systems, solving complex problems, thinking about user experience, things like that.
So more like architects or conductors guiding the AI and making sure everything works together.
Yeah, exactly. They become the creative directors of the software, and the AI is like their, super efficient assistant. Now, this doesn't mean everyone's job is safe. Some jobs that involve very repetitive coding tasks might be automated away, but I think overall vibe coding will create more opportunities than it destroys.
And those opportunities, they're not just for programmers, right?
Exactly. Think about all the people who have great ideas for apps or websites but don't know how to code. Now they have the power to bring those ideas to life. Entrepreneurs, teachers, artists, anyone can become a software creator.
So it's about democratizing technology, making it accessible to everyone. But with all this power, there are also some ethical concerns, right?
Absolutely. As with any powerful technology, we need to be careful about how we use it. One big concern is bias. If the AI models are trained on biased data, they could generate code that is discriminatory or unfair. Like imagine an AI that's trained on data that mostly includes male faces. It might then generate code for a facial recognition system that doesn't work as well for women. That's just one example. But it highlights the need to be very careful about the data we use to train these models.
So it's not just about the technology itself, it's about the values we bake into it.
Exactly. And another concern is security. If we rely too much on AI to generate code, we need to make sure that the code is secure and doesn't have vulnerabilities that hackers could exploit. Think about like an AI generating code for a banking app. If there's a security hole in that code, it could have serious consequences.
So while vibe coding can be a powerful tool for good, we need to use it responsibly and think carefully about the potential downsides.
Absolutely. And that's why things like transparency and accountability are so important. We need to be able to understand how these AI models are making decisions, and we need to hold the people who create and use them accountable for the consequences of their actions.
So it's not just a tech issue, it's a societal issue. We need to have these broader conversations about how to use AI ethically and responsibly.
Yeah, it's not just about building cool things. It's about building things that are good for society, that are fair, inclusive, and safe for everyone. And that's a responsibility we all share, from the developers to the users to the policymakers.
And I think that's a great place to wrap things up. Vibe coding is this incredibly exciting and potentially transformative technology. It has the power to democratize software development, to make it faster and more accessible, and to unlock creativity and innovation in ways we can't even imagine yet. But it also comes with some serious ethical challenges that we need to address thoughtfully and proactively. Ultimately, the future of vibe coding and the impact it will have on our lives is up to us.
It is. So what will you build?